on-ground flavor of impact investing in India. And as Ranjna said, do go for the site visits, because I'm reminded of a few words a colleague of mine recently said. She was visiting us from Austin, and she said, every time I'm in India and go for a field visit, I feel I'm on the front lines of a war zone. It's exciting, it's exhausting, it's exhilarating. She said just the energy levels, the aspirations, the positivity to take charge of the people and, transform life outcomes for themselves is just so inspiring and contagious. So, I think a lot of those words resonated with me, especially when I go down to the field in India and see, the work of several of our impact investors and social ventures. So as I welcome you to the war zone, I do want to call out a few names, starting with Neha here. If you can just identify yourself, Neha, Sugandhi, Ranjna was just here, Arvind and Aman. I think this is the small and mighty team that has really worked hard to make this day special. And when they started preparing for it, I think the principle was, we'll have 300 people in a room giving us 6 hours of their life, which they will never get back, on a Sunday afternoon. We better make it, as productive and meaningful for them as we can. So on that spirit was the whole preparation done, and I do hope you have a good afternoon. And as you get into the war zone of India's impact investing, I just wanted to share 3 aspects that really stand out for me. The first one being scale. Of course, India is a country of 1.4 billion people. Only one country beats us to that, that's no secret. But 1.4 billion is not the market for impact investors. We only take a segment of it. At the bottom end, we have maybe 22% of people who are below the poverty line. That's not the segment which can actually, buy products and services from social enterprises. Of course, there's a middle income end and a high income end. I think the segment that impact investors cater to is right above the below the poverty line segment. And I have Vivek here. McKinsey recently released some statistics that 56% of India's population does not have access to basic minimum, services like water, sanitation, housing, health, education. And so it's this 56% net of the 22% below poverty line, which really is the market that we are addressing. And that's a good 500 million people. So in terms of scale, for impact investing, nothing beats India. The second aspect is really the aspiration of the Indian consumer or the Indian low-income consumer. Again, given that we are in a high-growth economy, there is positivity and aspiration at the bottom of the economic pyramid. I think the customer is willing to leverage any opportunity he or she gets to get out of poverty. So just as an example, I think at least half of the people in the low-income segment, which is that 1/3 of India's population, is sending their children to fee-paying private schools because they want the best education. There's aspiration that, my child will grow up and get us out of poverty. Similar is the case with healthcare, etc. So there's already a there's already a market at that segment. Today it is being delivered, at the grassroots by local innovation, the grassroots entrepreneur. And where impact investing steps in is to say we can institutionalize this market, we can unlock the market. It already exists. We just need to now, scale it up and deliver quality standards on it. So that really is one aspect of India's investing landscape, which helps us deliver higher financial returns. So I don't see anybody from Unitas Capital here. No. Okay, there. So they recently released a report which showed that of the exits they enabled in impact investing in India, the returns were like 6x of, at a median level, there was 6x of the amount invested, 60% IRR at the median. And McKinsey released a report last year on a much broader spectrum, where they said that the median returns were 12%, but the top percentile is 34%. Anyway, all these numbers really point out the returns are there, the market is there, it is exciting, and possibly if you need even more returns, you should hire Unitas Capital for that. But so I think that's the second aspect, which is aspiration. The third is technology, with 70% cell phone penetration, with almost 50% of that segment using smartphones. I think it's easier to reach out to our low-income customers. So even if we are delivering small ticket size products to them, even if the margins are low, the delivery channel has been created. And again, there are several examples of that which I will not go into. But I would just say 3 key words for me on India's impact investing is scale, aspiration, technology. So I, as Ranjna said, represent the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, and we have been amongst the founding members of Impact Investors Council. The foundation today has invested $200 million in India. We have about 50 impact enterprises and funds that we've invested in. Over the last 10 or 12 years, we've had our share of success, exits, learnings, failures, challenges, all of it. And I think what keeps us going is just the opportunity to have transformative impact at scale. So I really do hope you can get glimpses of that opportunity over the course of the day. And on that note, I have the easy and difficult task of introducing Sir Ronald Cohen. Easy because he needs no introduction, and difficult because if I launch into an introduction, I'll take the 4 hours. So let me not go there, but just say that I was going to say one of the strongest, but I think he is the strongest proponent of impact investing globally. Besides being, the father of British venture capital, I would say he's created the family for impact investing. I think just the institutions he founded have been such pioneers and bridged gaps in the ecosystem that has now led the industry to grow. And on a personal note, I would say I haven't met anybody who's so passionate and committed to the cause, a perfectionist, and above all, I think just his humility is unparalleled. So let's welcome Sir Ronald Cohen and kick off the event.
The Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, and for all you do to push the borders of philanthropy and of investment in the direction of creating even greater impact. And thank you to the IIC for hosting us here, and to the IIC and the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation for supporting the Impact Summit, which is starting this evening just next door. Here we have a record crowd of 250 people, and to the summit we also have a record crowd of 900 people from 54 countries. This compares with 560 people from 40 countries just 1 year ago in Chicago. And the role of the IIC is crucially important in India, because the IIC is really the National Advisory Board of the Global Steering Group, which I chair, and which is organizing this summit. The National Advisory Board, in this case, the IIC, are really the vanguard of the impact revolution. And just the fact that they have assembled such a cross-section of people in one place is evidence of the importance of that role. New investment approaches take a long time to get established. I had the privilege of being involved in the establishment of the venture capital and the private equity industry. And I have to say I'm really delighted to have so many LPs in the room. I always enjoyed a very close relationship with LPs, and without them, we would never have been the sector that we have become today, a $5 trillion sector. And I well remember one LP in particular, Tom Judge of the AT&T Pension Fund, who I think was the first to receive a significant allocation to venture capital. And people would ask Tom Judge, what are you going to do with the money? And he'd say, I'm going to invest it in venture capital. He said, but can you prove it's going to work? And he'd say, no, but I have faith it will. And of course it did. And look today, the most sophisticated investors have 20% of their assets in venture capital and private equity. And with impact investment, we have the same thing. If venture capital had to contend with a myth that young people can't possibly catch up with big established businesses, that innovation is the prerogative of the biggest businesses who will do it best, then impact investment is also contending with two myths. The first is that impact can't be measured. Impact can and is being measured. It's being measured for specific investments and specific interventions like social impact bonds, but we're also on the way to measuring it for companies. And I predict that within a decade, many companies, perhaps as many as 20% of companies, will be publishing impact-weighted accounts according to generally accepted impact principles alongside their financial accounts. The second myth is that there's a necessary trade-off between doing good and doing well, between having an impact and making a superb return. That myth is already being exploded, as Geeta said, here in India, but in many countries across the world, by impact entrepreneurs who understand that when you bring an impact lens to a business, you affect both the risk and the return dimension of their decisions. You improve the long-term risk because governments are going to be supporting you and they're going to be penalizing those who are polluting the environment and creating social issues in the wake of their activities. And so, when you consider the scale of the issues that we face today, the ability to reduce the long-term risk of businesses that do harm is something that we can call into question today. It's the new entrants who are going to be innovating with new business models who are going to prove the case, just as they did with technology in venture capital. And they're also proving that impact affects the return dimension. It affects it because you begin to look at new sets of opportunities that you would never have looked at before. You begin to look, as Geeta was saying, at opportunities where there's huge latent demand at a lower price point, where if you design the right product or the right service, you can grow faster than the mainstream economy. And maybe gives you more effective business models to disrupt the mainstream economy itself. India offers possibly the biggest potential in the world, because impact investment has already taken root here. There are $5 or $6 billion of impact investment defined as investments where impact is measured, as well as financial return. And the scale of the issues demands huge innovation if we are to make a dent in improving people's lives. And so we can expect to see the Steve Jobses and the Bill Gates of impact investment come from India. If I look ahead, and McKinsey have just published a paper today, which I hope you'll have a chance to see, on the impact economy, I can see that we have no choice but to make impact investment a success and to let us lead us to impact economies, where decisions are made on the basis of risk, return, and impact. And regulation supports that. And just making money for a business is no longer acceptable for its customers, its shareholders, or its employees. So I salute you for being here today, and I look forward to hearing the result of your deliberations. There's never been a more urgent need for impact investment or a better time than right now. The lives of billions of people, as well as the existence of our planet, depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Cohen. And with that, I would launch us into the next set of discussions. We have three very strong voices from India's impact investing sector coming up next. And to kick that off, let me invite Roopa, Kudva, who will tell us about 10 years of their impact investing journey. Roopa, of course, I think, again, everybody knows her, but she's the partner and managing director at Omidyar Networks.
Thank you, Geeta, and good afternoon, friends. First up, thanks to the Impact Investors Council for the opportunity to speak at Prabhav. It is terrific to see everyone from the impact investing community gathered here today, including several of the partners that we work with. Today, I'm going to talk about our journey in India. We've completed 10 years of working in India, and we thought we'd share with you a little bit about what we've learned here during the course of our work, and also a little bit about how we are thinking of the journey ahead. Omidyar Network made its first investment in India in 2008. And if there is one thing that has defined the decade since then, it is the unprecedented growth of technology, and in particular, penetration of the mobile phone. We also have Aadhaar and the other elements of the India stack, the eKYC, the eSign, the digital locker, and the low-cost payments infrastructure, which is the unified payments interface. Technology is now ubiquitous, and it has been the source of fundamental change and transformation in our society. Technology is creating inclusivity for many instead of exclusivity for just a few. And at the same time, we feel that there has been a significant push towards inclusive growth. Thanks to a series of policy decisions and initiatives, as well as some landmark judicial decisions over the last decade, the focus in India today has shifted from opening bank accounts to financial health, from enrollment in school to learning outcomes. And also issues like ease and affordability of owning a home, issues like data protection and privacy have taken center stage. All these developments are driving entrepreneurship in a very big way. And today we see a new wave of purpose-driven entrepreneurs who are coming up with innovative business models, trying to improve the lives of the aspiring middle and lower income consumers. We believe that it is these entrepreneurs who are going to define the future of Indian entrepreneurship for the next several decades. And we at Omidyar Network consider ourselves privileged and fortunate to work with several of them. So far, we've invested $250 million in India. 70% of this is by way of equity investments and 30% by way of grants. Our active investments in India currently represent a quarter of our active investment globally. Our investees in India have reached 270 million consumers and beneficiaries, and there are 18 of them who each have a reach of greater than 1 million. So what have we learned in India in these 10 years? We have 6 key learnings. Number 1, the mobile phone is one of the biggest drivers of social impact in India. As smartphones become ubiquitous and as data costs decline, both businesses and governments are now easily able to reach population segments that they could not before. And these population segments tend to be underserved and excluded. Using the mobile phone, entrepreneurs are now able to provide a whole range of utilitarian and aspirational products and services to them. Access to information, jobs, transportation, government services, education, digital health, and financial services. Here on the right, you can see the logos of some of our investees who are doing just that. Learning 2 is on failures. We've had our share of failures, that is investments that were written off, and those that did not have the desired social impact. And when we look at the reasons for failures, they've been varied. Lack of a robust investment thesis, large check sizes for unproven business models, underestimating the capital intensity of the business, lack of focus on feedback on concerns that was mentioned during founder reference checks, for example, or even underestimating the complexities that some of the nonprofits would face in working with governments. But even as we continue to learn from failures, we want to ensure that failures don't make us unduly risk-averse and inhibit us from making the bold bets that our risk capital is ideally suited for. Learning 3, funding quality research can inspire change in many ways. It can sensitize entrepreneurs to new opportunities. It can also provide valuable data and insights to drive policy decisions and debates. Our report on the next $500 million identified what it takes to succeed with the next wave of first-time internet users coming online over the next 5 years. Similarly, our 2 State of Aadhaar reports produced data that brought nuance to a highly polarized debate in India about issues like exclusion, data errors, and privacy. Learning 4, unlocking supply of capital is nascent, is catalytic in nascent markets. We support the Impact Investors Council, which we believe has done outstanding work in creating a greater awareness of impact investing and in driving a greater flow of capital to impact investing. We also support organizations that help philanthropists define their vision and adopt a more strategic approach to their giving, and also organizations that help measure progress and impact of CSR and philanthropic funding efforts. Our 5th lesson is on the power of a global-local combination. We had our Silicon Valley heritage, our global network, and our learnings from business models all over the world. We combined that with a team on the ground here in India with a deep understanding of the local context and strong relationships with key players in the Indian ecosystem. And even as we continue to retain the core of our global model, which is our dual checkbook comprising equity investments and grants, our focus on technology, and our efforts and strategies centered around global sector change, we have adapted these strategies specifically for India. So two examples, for example, SME finance and citizen-centric legal systems are areas where we work in only in India and not in other parts of the world. And finally, lesson number 6 is that we've learned to focus on the white spaces, because pioneering business models have a multiplier effect. Some of our investees have gone on to have a significant impact beyond just their immediate consumer or beneficiary base. They have opened new markets, driving inclusivity and affordability. They have also prompted other entrepreneurs to come into the space and also crowded in capital from other investors into the space. So, how do we think about the journey ahead, and what is our purpose here in India? Despite the major strides that India has made in the last decade, a young and aspiring India wants to see even more rapid change. And therefore, increasingly today, we are seeing Indians from all walks of life who are confidently stepping forward to tackle some of India's most difficult challenges. And therefore, at Omidyar Network India, we support entrepreneurs in the private, public, and not-for-profit sector who are addressing some of the most chronic and the toughest problems in India. And so, our purpose in India is to invest in bold entrepreneurs who help create a meaningful life for every Indian. And when we say a meaningful life, we mean a life of opportunity, of dignity, and of rights. And our thinking about every Indian is shaped by the belief that India's growth and prosperity should not be confined just to the top 300 million, but needs to benefit every Indian. And hence, our focus at Omidyar Network India is on those who are excluded, underserved, and disempowered in an India that is becoming increasingly digital. Over the next 5 years, 500 million Indians are going to come online for the first time through their mobile phones. And this is a population that we refer to as the next 500 million. The next 500 million represent the broadest array of ages and occupations, from kirana shop owners and BPO workers to drivers and garment factory workers. They have bold aspirations. They often have little education, but dream of sending their children to engineering college. They manage significant personal debt, but want financial security for their children. Our focus is on empowering the next 500 million aspirers along with the lowest income segments. It is our investees that you see here who are serving the next 500 million. They are the ones who are helping every Indian create a more meaningful life. They are our heroes, they are our inspiration, and they are the reason we at Omidyar Network come to work every day. And they are the reason that we are Omidyar Network. Thank you.
The estimate is that you need about $5 to $7 trillion a year, and there's just no way that government capital or government spending and philanthropic capital is going to kind of address that. I think in the context of India, another key statistic is that if we looked at the Millennial Development Goals, which kind of finished in 2015-16, they were a reasonable success. And to a large extent, they were a success because the progress that China made in getting its population kind of out of poverty. I think the key issue for the UN SDGs going forward for 2030 is that while we've got a lot of initiatives going on globally, if we are not successful in India with the UN Sustainable Goals, I think it'll be very hard for them to actually be achieved. So within that kind of background and framework, right now we have approximately 25% of the world's kind of investable assets with some sort of impact overlay. That's approximately $25 trillion. A large chunk, or in fact, the majority of that, 99 to 95% of that, is in the public markets through various structures. The private markets actually still are quite small in the impact investing space. And so the real question really is, which I will open up to the panelists, is how do we actually go from point A to point B? From an academic perspective, one of the key issues is that we just don't have enough evidence that suggests that impact investing actually can deliver returns while doing good at the same time, even though I know earlier today there were some comments from Ronnie and McKinsey, etc., which show good trends, but are the trends long enough? Have they been around long enough? So with that, let me start with Karen, with you. From a broader global perspective, what do you see as the current state of play, if you see in impact investing, and how do you see more capital being drawn and attracted to it?
Thanks very much, Vikram. So first of all, I wanted to say that there is this broader movement towards impact, which, as Sir Ronald said earlier in the day, it started a number of decades ago. So it's not that the SDGs came along and suddenly everyone cares about impact. I mean, there's been a big movement of companies thinking about ESG, CSR, all of these things, the growth of social enterprise, more and more investors that are interested in investing for impact, starting with foundations and high net worth individuals and family offices. Also in the development finance community, more and more people thinking about how they can maximize the development impact and blended finance approaches. The COP process, developing standards in the environment and green space, and also the SDGs. So this is really a whole sort of broader movement and sea change. And I think we need to be careful not to frame it only in the SDGs, because we also don't want to set ourselves up for targets that maybe aren't going to, maybe it might be hard to meet, but not to be less ambitious, but to realize that there's this broader movement going on. And it's important that we're learning from the development finance community and all the great work that's been done there, the green finance community, and also the impact investment community. And actually at OECD, we're trying to bridge these different silos, because it's almost like these different communities are recreating the wheel. And there's a lot of expertise in measurement and evaluation that we can really leverage across these sectors. So that's sort of the first point. The second thing is there's a lot of talk. And talk is important. We need these kind of conferences, but we also need to make sure we're walking the talk. And I think there, we have a number of issues. Now, first of all, we know that the interest of international investors in developing countries' emerging markets is growing, which is great. We also know that the majority of those investors are DFIs, so great to have Nick here. So getting more of the private investors, particularly not only the international, but also the national, the local investors is critical, and I think that's one of the big issues here in the panel. And there are a couple of issues. First of all, starting with the international investors, some of them, maybe particularly some of the private ones, maybe the perception of risk is higher than the actual risk, and they tend to invest in the usual suspects, whether it's the middle-income countries, whether it's the investing in certain cities and certain sectors, or investing in people that went to some of the international schools that are connected to the international networks. So how can we make sure that we're getting beyond the usual suspects and getting money to where it's really needed? So I think that's one issue. Also, we've seen through some of the work that we've been doing at OECD that there's not as much of a connection between the public sector and the private sector as there should be, or between the international community and the local community. So if we really want to move forward and unlock more capital locally, there needs to be more of a connection there. In terms of domestic investors here in India, thanks to the great work of IIC, there's an ecosystem that's been developing, there's greater awareness and knowledge about the market, which is terrific. But perhaps in some of the areas where perhaps more can be done, of course, one big area is the area of policy. I won't go into that in more detail now, but I could later if needed. But the other big area, and of course for OECD, this is a huge priority for us, is this area of evidence. We at OECD, we love data, we love standards, we love cases and policies, But really, if we want to move the market forward, and if we want to bring more investors in, we need to have more transparency. People need to understand, first of all, what is impact investing? What are we talking about? Where are the boundaries? Also, they need to understand about the data, even the basic activity data. How much of this is happening? Where is it happening? Who's doing this? We see a lot of examples. It's the same 5 examples. Is that really all that's going on? What's really happening? Then we get to performance data. What is the financial performance? What is the impact performance? Of course, these things are not easy, especially impact performance isn't easy to measure. But there is a lot of great work going on in that area, and we're happy to OECD to be part of this next phase of the INP coalition, and hope to work with other organizations on that going forward. Anyways, I would say that evidence, although policy is obviously very important in unleashing the market, I would say that evidence and the data and the definitions is really where, at least we at OECD, are really focusing a lot of our time and effort.
Thank you, Karen. Uli, if I may just turn it over to you, and then we'll come back to some of your comments, particularly on the issue of policy, evidence, and blended finance. It would be great for you to share your experiences in Europe and what you see the trends over there and how they may apply to India.
Sure. Well, I think I'm talking a little bit from a privileged situation, because our investment remit is with a few extensions into the neighboring countries within the European Union. But I think what is relevant to the topic that we're discussing here today is that our role in the market is to be catalyst for private sector investors to engage in sectors that we consider being worthwhile to be developed and scaled. And one of our main fields of activity is the one of impact investing and social impact as much as environmental impact being at the front page of that. I think one striking experience that made us change our approach to the market was when we were going to the market and inquiring with institutional investors why they did not do more in impact investing. Frequently the answer was there aren't enough opportunities. And when this whole debate about the SDGs came about, and this agreement in 2015 that there were something like $30 trillion of incremental finance needed in order to get the SDGs done, we paused a bit and said, well, does that mean that we don't have enough problems? Because I think if we have 30 trillion to deploy to solve the SDGs, we cannot reasonably claim that there are not enough opportunities to deploy money. The fact actually that derives from that is that we do not have enough investable impact in the market, rather than not having enough market for impact as such. And I think that was a pivotal point in our design of the market approach. We were going out no longer with the perspective of mobilizing additional capital and finding more players in the market that would be ready to put money at work for some impact in the equation. But we were actually going out to the market with a mindset where we said, how can we multiply the market actors that make impact investable? And I think that is something which, with respect to the SDGs, is a perspective that we can apply globally, because it is not that we are missing capital that is ready to do something with a societal dimension in the investment decision process, with an environmental, social dimension in the investment decision process, but we do not have enough actors in the market that translate impact into something that can be funded with the financial means that are currently in the market. And I think that is one of the common themes that as an impact investing community we need to solve, because we have been going naively by the assumption that somebody who calls him or herself an impact investor necessarily cares about what impact is achieved. That is not necessarily the case. This translation is to be done by other stakeholders in the market that actually cater for the impact in the first place and make it fundable.
So can you, actually before I go on to the next speaker, to Nick, can you give an example of when you talked about being a catalyst to bring in more impact investors? Could you give us an example of what you may have done in Europe to make that happen?
Yeah, we've been setting up, for instance, a number of payment per result schemes that were looking at specific societal issues to be solved. Many of them in the educational unemployment and in the refugees, migration crisis management, where actually an issue has been identified as being one of bringing people with a migrant background into the employment market, and having made the observation that in the normal system that takes between 2 and 3 years, and in those between 2 and 3 years, many of them become non-placeable because of the fact that they are basically rejecting the society in which they have decided to move into because they haven't been accepted and haven't found a way to find roots there. And the approach taken in those payment per result instruments was to select alternative models to deal with that specific issue and make that specific issue with funding schemes of layered risks fundable by institutional investors. And that's something that has definitely overcome the issue of capital accessibility. Whether the results are going to be there, the jury is out.
Yeah, so I think the whole issue of creating opportunities to either de-risk situations or etc. to bring in private capital is absolutely key. So Nick, CDC has been pretty active in India. You've been investors in some of the funds that are sitting in the room. It'd be great to hear your perspective on how CDC looks at the whole impact investing landscape and your experience in India itself.
Yeah, thank you, Vikram, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure particularly, of course, because India is really probably the most vibrant and dynamic of all the impact investment markets around the world. So that's a great testament to the work that IIC and all of you in the room have done. CDC, is, as I suspect many of you know, is the UK's development finance institution. It was in fact the world's first development finance institution, founded 70 years ago. And when we were founded, our first chairman, a gentleman called Lord Reith, who some of you will know was also the founder of the BBC, when asked what CDC's mission was, he said it was to do good without losing money. And that was in 1948. And I think to a large extent that is what CDC has been trying to do ever since then, trying to invest, create development impact at the same time as we earn financial returns. India came into our portfolio almost exactly 30 years ago, and for the last 3 decades we've been a significant investor in India. And in fact, one of the important roles, I know many of you in the room are running impact funds, and one of the really important roles that CDC has played in India is as a cornerstone to really the whole private equity industry, starting from the mid-90s. When the organization of CDC realized there was a need to help develop a private equity industry here, we've been a cornerstone investor in a whole range of different funds. I think we've invested in the last 15 years alone about 70 different funds here in India, which probably makes us the largest, or certainly the most broad-based LP in the country. And as well as, and obviously when we were helping to kick off the industry, we were focused on, or we felt our value, our additionality was just being there. So many of the funds that we supported were larger, focusing on larger transactions. But we also played, I think, an important role in some of the impact funds. So we were an early investor in Avishkar, we were an early investor in Log Capital, for example. But I think if we, and we're fortunate because this is a time when development finance is very much front and center in the development agenda. And as a result of that, we're getting more money. So we have more capital to spend. In the next, we will announce when we're here that in the next 3 years, CDC will be investing $1.7 billion in India and the surrounding and the neighboring countries. Of that, I'd suspect that probably $350 to $400 million will go into funds here in India. So that's a reasonably significant amount over the next 3 years. But I think our approach will change, and I think when you think about raising money from a CDC or indeed from any other DFIs, you have to sort of position yourself for these changes. We're no longer going to be an investor in large funds where our capital, frankly, is not terribly additional. We're not going to be an investor in broad-based, more generalist funds. What we're looking for is a focus. Specifically, we're looking for a sector focus. This economy and this market is big enough for funds of almost any size to have clear sector objectives. Part of the advantage of that is obviously they have expertise in those sectors, but secondly, it helps, we hope, for them to be able to report the impact that they're having on people's lives more easily by being more concentrated and more focused. So the sectors that we care about are, or the areas we care about are areas where private equity and investment can help provide affordable, accessible goods and services to the poorest people in this country. So that is affordable housing. It's health, particularly health where those health services or diagnostics are being made available to poorer people. It's agriculture, particularly smallholder agriculture. It's financial services, and not large cap lending, but lending to SMEs, to micro SMEs, and particularly to in microfinance, where we've already been a big investor. And to a somewhat more limited extent, it's in venture capital. So we've recently supported a fund using AI to work on particularly in the medical diagnostics area. So those are the sort of areas we're going to be looking at from a sector perspective. The other thing we look at very seriously is the regional focus of the funds. This is a country where you've had enormous growth in many of the larger urban areas, but you still have, in the northern and eastern states, 50% of the population receiving about 5% of the investment capital. And we see our mission at CDC as being focused on helping to drive capital into some of those poorer states. And I was in UP, for example, a month or so ago, and in UP it's as big as, it's over 200 million people. It's as big as Nigeria, which is our single biggest market in Africa. And yet there's enormous potential. There's a real lack of jobs, a real lack of private sector opportunity there. So those are the sort of things I think we will be seeking to do as we talk to fund managers. We will also be looking to try to encourage people to look at alternative structures. And we can maybe come back to this, why the LP, just a traditional GP LP model, which most of India has followed, is not a particularly good model for what many of you are trying to do. It is an expensive model, and it also is a short-term model. And what we're trying to do, much of the impact we're trying to have requires much longer-term investment. We can talk about blended finance. We have a separate impact portfolio, which is more focused on Africa, where we've used blended finance tools to try to help mitigate the risks, the additional risks that are being taken by some of these managers. So those are a range of different things. So I suppose the good news to conclude is that CDC will continue to be a significant investor in India, and particularly in the private equity and impact fund area. The challenge, I suppose, is how do we do that in a way that maximizes impact through more sector focus, more regional concentration, and more innovation in the way that we structure the transactions.
Well, thank you, Nick. That's obviously very good news for a lot of people in terms of the 1.7 billion and the 300, 400 million. It's made this session worthwhile for a lot of people in the room. But before I go on to Siddharth, so there's the DFI angle, and obviously CDC and some of the other DFIs have been quite active in India and some of the emerging markets. But how do you see getting more private sector capital into the business? Capital that's focused on either a commercial or maybe even some sort of concessionary return, but is focused on a return and probably doesn't have the long-term time horizon that a DFI may.
Yeah, I think we have one shareholder that's different. When different sets for me my objectives every year. One of the key objectives is to figure out how CDC can play a broader role in mobilization of capital. Now, to a large extent, that is, we're fortunate. We live in London. world's largest international financial center, and actually a time when there's an increasing interest in how can mainstream institutions put money behind the SDGs. So we have a role to play in that. We have more, particularly in our target markets of Africa and South Asia. Just in terms of communication, Karen touched on the point of risk and how much risk really does exist in this market. We have the largest portfolio of PE funds in those countries. We have an underlying equity portfolio, so we can share a lot in terms of risk. And just sort of encouragement to people, mainstream institutions to do more. But I think, and perhaps what you're getting at more is, the biggest challenge for the Indian impact fund market is to attract more money from here. And that, and currency has a lot to do with that, because obviously returns have been hurt, particularly this year, by the weakness of the currency. You find your international investors are dollar-based and will continue to be. Yet there are emerging sources of significant capital here in India. So I think, and I'm not sure how, and we've looked at various tools we can use to perhaps mitigate the risk of some of those investors coming in. We've looked at ways, and are looking at ways, where perhaps being a cornerstone and being sort of setting an example, doing the due diligence, providing the sort of support may give more confidence to the local market. But I think there is a limited amount that a CDC can do in developing this local market, and it is critical to the growth of the industry here.
Yeah, I think the local, there's one issue of just increasing the amount of capital going into impact in India, but I think the statistics suggest that in most of the funds that are even India-based funds, 90% plus of the capital actually is foreign capital. And that is obviously a huge issue. In fact, one of the reasons we set up Asha Impact was 3-4 years ago was actually to focus on domestic investors to invest domestically, and we made some reasonable progress in that, but perhaps could be doing a lot more. Yes,
can I just add one thing to that? Yeah, I think one of the issues here in India is typically you need a vibrant private equity industry, and the impact fund industry sort of comes out of that. I think the PE industry here has got an issue in terms of returns over the last 15 years or so. The returns relative to the public market have not been good. And if you're an asset allocator, a large institution, whether it's in India or anywhere else, and you're looking at an asset class that has less liquidity, more risk, and has historically underperformed public assets, you're not going to attract a lot of money. So I think that's also part of the challenge.
Exactly, the track record. Well, Owen has been here for 10 years. We heard from Roopa this morning about the progress that you've made. And well, again, we've looked at statistics, and obviously IIC has been a leader in this on India being a more vibrant impact investing ecosystem than, say, other markets. But if you actually do the analysis, a big chunk of the money that's gone into impact investing has really been dominated by clean tech or microfinance, essentially. So in terms of your experience over here, how do you see that changing? What are the other industries, Nick touched on, housing, healthcare, but none of those have actually generated the kind of returns that one would expect from a private equity perspective. So maybe your perspective on that.
Sure. Thanks, Vikram. I think the basic premise that impact investing is a different industry from general PE investing is something I think we have to accept. And therefore the return profiles and the timelines we'll invest behind are also very different. And we should keep that in mind. We view that as a cornerstone of the way we invest at Omidyar network, which is what we call our flexible capital approach, where there'll be companies that we can expect to get market returns in market-defined timelines. There'll also be at the other extreme grants where we expect nothing back. And in the interim, there'll be places where we're investing ahead of the market, getting other folks to come in and follow our capital, where we expect lower than market returns, but in return for significant impact. So that's been a thesis of the way Omidyar networks invested across the last decade, and I think that doesn't change anytime soon. That said, what we've seen happen is that there's a bunch of very interesting sectors that are now developing. So clearly you mentioned financial services as the one that's driven most of the impact investing returns so far. I think this is also the first sector where impact investing started in India. So it's clearly the most mature sector as well. It's had time to show the fullness of its returns, and it's been a great success for folks. What we are seeing going forward, clean tech will likely be in that area as well. It's drawn large dollars. We also think, like Roopa mentioned earlier today, that there's a big change happening because of the way technology is changing the way businesses work. And that really is a big thesis behind what drives returns in impact investing in India over the next 5 to 10 years. The next 500 million people coming online actually are able to access services, products that weren't available to them earlier, and using technology that makes it much cheaper. And that will open a ton of areas. So if you look at the investments we've done and the industry is doing, there are models around healthcare delivery, which earlier wouldn't have been possible without physical presence in remote areas, which doesn't scale. You can't expect returns with that. You can now do it in a centrally located manner using technology. There are investments around agriculture, which work similarly by using technology to be able to increase yields. So a bunch of interesting stuff that's happening, but it is also newer. So my guess is over the next 4 to 5 years, at least that's what we work behind, these services, products focused towards the next 500 million using technology as a base are really what's going to drive the breakthrough returns in India when we have the chat now in the next few years.
But you know, you started your comments just now by saying we have to recognize that impact investing is different than other PE. But actually, if you look at the marketing materials of a lot of funds in this room, or any global funds that maybe don't spend a lot, they always talk about market-based returns and we're going to make money and do good at the same time. And you know, that's kind of highly seductive, right? I mean, if you can earn great returns and be doing it, who wouldn't do that? So how come most of the funds market themselves that way if you think that things are really that different?
Sure. So to be fair, if you look at the returns thus far, that was a research that McKinsey done for us, which I think we should all go through in some detail. Returns actually have been pretty impressive. A bulk of those returns have been driven by financial services. And I think that's just a function of the way the industry started, when that was just the first sector the industry invested behind. And over time, that's come to a stage when pretty interesting returns have been reaped. I think if we look forward from now, as some of the new sectors develop, education, agriculture, access to services which are outside of financial services, I think it's fair to say that there will be time taken for these to develop. It won't be your standard VC investment where you have a 3-year entry exit. We should all expect these to be longer timelines, and once you go in with those, with our eyes wide open, I think the rewards are quite outsized.
So essentially what you're saying is that there's, as Roopa was saying this morning too, there's a big, huge market, and the question is coming out of the right business models with the right time frame. Would you agree with that kind of hypothesis based on your experiences?
So I can share with you some of our data from sort of high-level data from CDC. The first thing I would say is, actually, if we look at our Indian portfolio, the impact funds have done better than the mainstream portfolio, and that has a lot to do with the fact that they've been overweight in microfinance and came back into the market post to sort of 2010 problems at a good time, and have done very well from that. So I mentioned before Avishkar and Lok, both of those are organizations that have given very good returns relative to the rest of the market. But overall, I'm not sure that that's really. I mean, that was I suppose a conscious asset allocation choice that came out of their impact imperative, which is a good thing. I'm not sure that that's endlessly repeatable. The other point, which they're touched on, is this question of, the other thing we see in CDC is enormous gross net spreads. And the average gross net spread in Indian funds is about 600 basis points a year, all right? So, and that's a function of the fees, it's a function of the fact that fees are charged on invested capital. It's a function that many of the funds that we naturally gravitate towards are smaller funds, if we want to try and help them get going. It is really, really difficult to earn returns, and I mentioned earlier this comparison with the public market. It's very difficult to earn really premium returns when there's that sort of leakage, and that's why we've tried to encourage in some of our markets the development of more permanent capital vehicles, which don't necessarily have these fee drags, and also can be long, where the investments really can be long term, because that is the other issue. If you're forced as an LP in an LP-GP relationship to get out of everything, hope to exit everything in 4 to 5 years, particularly with the type of investing that many of you are doing, that's just really an unrealistic ambition. CDC's investment, if we look at our direct portfolio, we've had investments that we've held since 1964. So you do have to, we are trying to squeeze impact investment into a model that doesn't really suit the underlying fundamentals of what we're trying to do.
So a lot of y'all, and I think Owen does this well, but all three of you alluded to, and then I'm going to open this up to the audience, but alluded to the whole issue of using your capital to kind of de-risk the private sector in a way. And we've also talked about the fact that bringing in domestic investors is critical. So do you have any thoughts or suggestions as to how we can use blended finance, so-called technology or ideas to really make that happen in India?
Sure, and I guess I would first raise the point that if we're really trying to de-risk these investors, are they really impact investors? You know, so I lead the work on impact investing at OECD. Another colleague leads the work on blended finance, another on green. And we have a shared team of people, and we're working together on finance for sustainable development. But at the end of the day, with impact investors, we're looking for investors that are really seeking impact. And these should be people that are willing to invest in the non-usual suspects. There's actually a lot of innovation, probably more innovation, I would argue, in developing countries than in developed countries. There are a lot of opportunities about how to reach those. Yeah, so I guess one of my comments about blended finance, and there are a lot of tools like guarantees and grants and technical assistance, and my colleagues are doing a whole bunch of work in this area. You know, we have to think about what type of investors are we trying to bring in. We need investors all across the spectrum. We need the ones that really only care about finance, that need to be de-risked, but we also need the ones that put impact first and are really trying to invest in these innovative solutions. Otherwise, we're never going to... More money is not the issue. It's creating new solutions. And I believe there are a lot of really great entrepreneurs out there. We need to find those entrepreneurs and support them. And the only way to do that is to build the local ecosystem, because the local investors have the networks, they have the context, they can reach and find these people. So it's not just about de-risking and bringing in all this commercial capital. It's also about really trying to engage the local investors with an impact focus.
Anyone of you would like to add to that? Yes, you would.
Well, maybe one perspective that I consider relevant is that when we go about the mobilization of capital, is that we are very aware of what we want to achieve with it. Because depending on what impact we want to achieve in a market, the instruments and the approach that we are taking to the market are very different. I think roughly speaking, when we look at instruments to develop capital inflows in certain market segments, we distinguish between three different types of impact. One being innovation, meaning identifying new solutions to societal issues that need to be dealt with in a different way if we want to lead to sustainability. And there you need to be, by definition, very opportunistic, because it's pretty hard to predict innovation. You need to give it a chance. Then we've got the impact that is looking at outreach, which is trying to replicate tested solutions in a different context, basically moving from the low-hanging fruits to the high-hanging fruits, if you want to. And then the third dimension is the issue of scale. How can we actually bring solutions that have been tested in the market, have been demonstrating that they work, how can we make them scalable to a level where they make a difference compared to the problem that they seek to address. And I think if we look at the readiness of the private sector to engage, we do have relative receptiveness of the market in the innovation part. And I think it's probably close to the experience that you have been mentioning, that the returns in that respect are not discouraging either, because I think there is a lot of potential in there. There's a lot of investor readiness when it comes to the right structures in the scaling issue, because investors do like the visibility of something that has been tested somewhere and actually can be brought to just a bigger dimension. Where we do have the biggest difficulties is carrying solutions that have been working in a kind of sterilized environment to the non-sterilized environment. Basically, moving from funding convenient impact to funding the inconvenient impact. There, I think, we have the biggest challenges.
Well, thank you, Lee. I'd like to then just open it out to the audience if we have any questions. Yeah, and if you could just briefly introduce yourself, and if there's specific panels you want to address it, let us know. Otherwise, we'll open it up to the panel.
Hi, I'm Khanna. I run Financing for Development in Geneva. The question is for Nick. Could you elaborate on the alternative structures for the LPGP? Is that something we can hear from you?
Yeah, well, I mentioned one, which is more permanent capital vehicle, which doesn't require exits, doesn't have the same sort of fixed management to the 2 and 20 structure. We've done one structure like that in Sierra Leone, for example, which is a small, very difficult market, and it allows the team that's in place to build up a long-term portfolio without having the pressure of exits. We have used blended. We have a separate pool of money dedicated towards sort of lower return funds, which we call our impact fund portfolio, although arguably everything we do hopefully is impact. But the impact fund portfolio, which we've been running for about 2 years, about 12 funds in it. Of those, majority are in Africa. There's one in Afghanistan, there's one in Myanmar. About half of those funds have used some form of blended finance. So somewhere, not typically CDC, the DFI, but somebody else who's willing to put in some sort of either first loss tranche or sometimes just a big grant level of TA or grant support or something to provide some level of subsidy. But as I said, I mean, we're talking about the first fund in Afghanistan, for example. I mean, that's pretty, I mean, I think everybody would accept that whatever you do in that country is going to be highly risky. So it really has to have a very high bar of impact and additionality.
Question back there, yeah. Get the mic there, please. To the right, yeah.
Hey, my name is Nina from Zanz. We are a private equity fund of funds investing in impact space based in Germany, and we have only private investors. I think my question would be, do you measure how much private capital you capitalize in total and also for each dollar invested? Maybe CDC.
Yeah, I mean, how do you measure? What is your measure for success as far as capitalizing capital goes?
The answer is pretty short and clear. Yes, we do measure how we capitalize capital, and we do that across our activities, not only in the impact investment space, because we are by nature a public-private partnership, and our corporate mission, if you want to, is to mobilize private sector capital. Hence, without tracking that on a regular basis, on a deal-by-deal basis, on a transaction-by-transaction basis, we would not exist.
And may I ask what the performance is of that KPI?
Actually, that depends very much on the market segment that we're looking at. On the longest-lasting activity that we have, which is in the venture space for funding technology and innovation, we've got a multiplier of around 5.5. And in the impact space, on the first generation of funds that we have been backing, we had a multiplier of 2. And we are currently somewhere in the second, third generations of funds that we're backing, a multiplier of between 3.2 to 3.8.
And CDC?
Yeah, well, I mean, every development finance institution reports reports the amount of capital it mobilizes. So you'll see that in the report of every DFI, including CDC. I think the amount at CDC last year was something around $750 million. But I will caution you, like all of these measures, there's a high level of subjectivity involved. And there are certain rules that the development finance institutions conform to, but it is really very difficult sometimes. We would like to think that many of the funds that we've gone into, cornerstoned, done sort of extensive due diligence on and so on, that helps to bring in other investors, and I think it certainly does. But how much of that you claim, and I suspect that sometimes we're in it, and the IFC are in it, and others are in it, and we're KFW, and we're all claiming the same mobilization. So I just caution you, it's an important statistic, it is measured, but it has to be treated like all these numbers with a certain amount of,
If I can add to the Indian example of that, because that's actually data we studied when we looked at the entire industry. The multiple in India of impact investors and the capital that they crowd in is upwards of 5 to 6x. So that number's worked out reasonably well in the Indian experience so far for us. Sorry, Karen.
In terms of private sector capital mobilized, well, the OECD collects ODA, or the source we collect data from DFIs and from others, but we also are working on collecting comparable data on other private flows that are mobilized. So we're working segment by segment. It's not easy for some of the reasons Nick mentioned, but the more we're able to collect that data and share that in a comparable way and make sure that the DFIs and others are using certain standards, the more reliable that data will become. So it's something that we really, it's a high priority for OECD.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I see a couple more questions, but I think just it's 7 o'clock, and I think we are kind of way out of time here. So I think the couple of themes that have come out here. One is that clearly track records matter, and the ability to bring in capital based on track records is critical. So the more data we can see, that's one. Two is that the important role that DFIs or organizations like OECD and ON can play in actually mobilizing capital is huge. But third, I think, is that what you all mentioned, that this actually is a massive market. So to the extent that we can come up with business models which match that market opportunity with the kind of capital, whether it's coming in the form of permanent capital or others in terms of innovative structures, will be absolutely critical. But it's a really an exciting time for the whole ecosystem of impact investing in India, and really appreciate you taking the evening to share your thoughts with us. So please join me in thanking the panel very much. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Arvind, or who do I hand it back to? Yes.
Ranjna, Neha, Sugandhi, Aman, could you join me on the stage? Before I give my closing remarks, which will be very short, I do want to observe a short silence in honor of our beloved ex-executive committee member, Ajit Madhavan, who passed away recently. Thank you. Today, we had some really insightful comments, and I'll just mention a couple. Rajiv Lall said that impact investing is about a moral crusade, it's about social justice. Roopa Kudva said our heroes are social enterprises. Karen Wilson said it's about finding solutions. Nick of CDC said India is the most vibrant market. It's focusing on health, agriculture, financial services, and also regional focus. The audience, we want to really thank you very much. You have traveled far and wide to come and be with us on a Sunday. We really appreciate it. We thank the LPs and GPs. More than 100 LP-GP meetings were organized. Hopefully this will lead to a flow of impact capital in India. I would like to thank the EC members, executive committee members, Geeta, Royston, Pradeep, Karthik, Siddharth, and Sri Krishna for helping us for the last several months in organizing this particular event. At this point, I would like to thank very much Ranjna, Neha, Sugandhi, and Aman is not here right now, for the marvelous work they did. They're all mothers of young children. The amount of sacrifice they made for this particular event is unbelievable. Thank you so much. I would also like to invite on the stage Geeta, Royston, Pradeep, Karthik, Siddharth and Sri Krishna. Would you mind coming to the stage? And because we need to have a photo of the group. Once again, thank you so much for being with us. And this is the end of our Prabhav 2018 as far as this particular event is concerned. We will have social tours, city tours on the 10th of October where we'll be visiting social enterprises. If you want to visit social enterprises, get onto the Prabhav 2018 website and register. Thank you, everybody.